Have you ever wondered what the process of composing for film is like? Well, I can't speak directly to how John Williams goes about it, but I can tell you how I've gone about it. Today we're going to be looking at my first venture into film scoring from 8 years ago. The film is titled Jeremiah Robs a Bank. Link in the description. And if you haven't seen the film yet and you want to watch it before I go and spoil the story, you should probably do so now. Jeremiah was the senior capstone project of my friend Michael Rose, who graduated from Brown University in 2013. I had graduated the year prior, and it was a total fluke that I ended up doing this. Mike hadn't been planning on having an original score at all. He just happened to mention in passing one day, I'm going to be working on this film project, and it's going to be a romantic comedy bank robbery story. And I thought to myself, that sounds fun. So I piped up and said, do you want someone to write an original soundtrack? And he said, sure. Now, I was not going into this completely cold because when my sister and I were growing up, we used to make silly films about our stuffed animals. And I used to devise soundtracks for these films that used existing classical music and sometimes used an original theme or two that I wrote. Only later did I learn that this is actually kind of what happens in Hollywood. They put together what are called temp tracks. When they're editing a film, they'll collect music from a lot of different sources just as placeholders so they can get the mood right and the pacing. Then they bring the composer in, and the composer will write the final score. Fun fact, the score for 2001: A Space Odyssey, which famously features a lot of classical music like Also sprach Zarathustra, The Blue Danube, and a bunch of other pieces, that was originally the temp track. Stanley Kubrick had hired composer Alex North to write an original score. And then I guess at some point during post-production, Kubrick decided he liked the temp track better. And poor Alex North, who went to the trouble of writing the score, only found out, I think, at the film's premiere that Kubrick had thrown his music in the trash. On a similar note, George Lucas had originally intended Star Wars to feature classical music, probably inspired partly by 2001: A Space Odyssey. And John Williams actually had to convince Lucas that the production would be better if he, Williams, wrote all of the music himself to give it greater thematic unity. And so that's why, for those of you who like picking on the Star Wars soundtrack for having passages that sound too much like The Planets or Rite of Spring or this or that famous piece of classical music, the reason is that those passages are where Williams was trying to compromise with Lucas's original musical intentions. And then subsequently in Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, Williams was able to devise a more distinct musical voice for the whole series. Anyway, I went off on a tangent there. Where was I? So yes, I did have some prior film scoring experience, but this was the first time that I would be writing all of the music myself, and it was also the first time that I would be working within someone else's vision. We didn't bother with a temp track for whatever reason. Mike gave me the script, which was written by Margaret Maurer, another graduating senior from Brown, and I just read that through to get some ideas. The only other bit of information I had beside the script was that the bank scenes were going to be filmed at the RISD Library, which was a bank back in the day. So knowing that and having the script in front of me, I dug through my inventory of unused melodic ideas and found something that I thought would work well for the establishing shot of the bank. The script doesn't actually say that there is going to be an establishing shot of the bank, but it just seemed to make sense that there would be one. That is the final mix, and I put that together using the East-West Symphonic Orchestra software library, which I didn't have at the time that I began work on Jeremiah. What I had was Apple Logic as my DAW, and that comes with some built-in orchestral sounds, which honestly leaves something to be desired. And I remember putting together a demo version of this bank theme for Mike, and using whatever Apple Logic instruments seemed the least objectionable. And I wish I could find that audio file because it would be a great comparison, but I don't seem to have it anywhere anymore. I do remember that Mike was, I think, a bit underwhelmed, and I don't blame him. He was suggesting maybe we could just do solo piano music, that would be great. And I was like, no way, all the best soundtracks have full orchestra. And because of that, I ended up taking the plunge and buying the East-West library. And the difference between Apple Logic's built-in orchestral instruments and that is just night and day. But I did end up compromising with Mike's suggestion of using piano. What I ended up doing was writing the soundtrack for orchestra, but then using the piano to represent the titular character. Another major artistic decision that Mike and I had to agree upon early was how much of the film would have music and how much of it would be unaccompanied. Because music can make or break a film. It depends on what's being shown. If it's an action film, then having a lot of music can be great. If the emphasis is on dialogue, then you have to be careful. Music can get in the way. It depends. If you have a love scene, then music can complement that quite nicely. But if you have an intellectual discussion, then it's very easy for music to just get in the way, and you're probably better off leaving that completely unaccompanied. Much of the humor of the film derives from its overly detailed narration. And so Mike and I decided that the narrated parts would have music, and the dialogue between the characters would not have music except starting about halfway through where the action really picks up. With that decided, the first thing I had to do was figure out Jeremiah's theme. And the film begins with a long stretch where the narrator introduces Jeremiah to us. So I put the script on the piano rack and read it aloud and improvised to that and came up with this.
This is Jeremiah. Here are some things you should know. He is 21 years old, 6'1", and weighs 165 pounds. Unfortunately, due to a misprint, his driver's license said that he is 16 feet 5 inches and weighs 61 pounds. His driver's license picture also isn't very good. The woman at the DMV scared him a little. Jeremiah learned how to square dance in his elementary school gym class. He has square danced ever since. He was a regional champion in high school. Jeremiah has never kissed a girl. These two things may or may not be correlated. He isn't sure.
I still think this came out pretty well for a couple reasons. One is the music has a slightly dorky quality to it, which goes well with Jeremiah's character. And the other reason is that because of its improvisatory nature, I was able to adjust the pacing of the music on the fly when I got the actual footage and heard the pacing of the narration that would actually be used. But there is a problem looking back which I didn't really appreciate at the time, and that is that the sound of the piano has a way of drawing attention to itself that the rest of the orchestra doesn't. Part of that is just that this piano is a really bright instrument, and part of it was the way I was playing it. Probably a little less detached, a little less staccato, a bit more pedal might have helped, but then that would have changed the character of the music completely, so I don't know. The proper thing to do would have been to record it on a different piano, or to just use the piano sounds that came with the East-West library, which were pretty good. But I felt on principle, if there was going to be a piano part, then I should be the one playing it on my piano. Next, the narrator introduces Lyle, who is Jeremiah's best friend, and who is trying to dissuade Jeremiah from robbing the bank. For this stretch, I just wrote a variation on Jeremiah's theme, and this was the first stretch where I used the East-West software, which I think put to rest any qualms Mike had about my orchestral intentions.
Just repeat what you said. Huh?
This is Lyle, also 21 years old. He is 5'10" and 187 pounds. He is Jeremiah's best friend.
This music does not fit this scene at all. Yes, it kind of fits the outdoor background, but then you have Lyle standing there looking kind of sus, and it's completely at odds with the music. Here's the thing. Normally, when you write for film, you're composing to the film footage. And a lot of composers, including John Williams, are on record saying they prefer not to read scripts. The reason being that if you read a script without seeing the footage, then you'll get your own ideas about the mood and the pacing, and you'll have some musical ideas which may not match the footage when you finally see it. But sometimes the schedule simply does not permit you to wait that long, and you have to start writing before you have film footage. And then you just had better have a bunch of different ideas that you can swap out as the occasion calls for it. The thing is, I don't actually know what I would do differently for Lyle. The reason is, we don't get to know him quite as well as the other characters. Aside from a flashback, which you'll see in a second, where you learn how he and Jeremiah became friends, mostly what we know of Lyle is he freaks out. And that's a bit of a difficult character to write music to.
On a class field trip to the zoo, Jeremiah climbed into the monkey cage for a closer look. For science. He was not aware that monkeys like to fling poo. There was a very specific monkey named Nom, who very specifically liked to fling poo at people's faces.
From this point on, the music starts to require a bit more planning. I would get some ideas for this passage, and I'd think, okay, that gives me a tempo and a beat. And given that tempo and that beat, I can work out how many measures will cover this much narration. 4 measures will take me to this line, another measure and a half will get me here, another 5 measures, then Lyle hits the monkey in the face, and so on. And I just had to hope that my guess as to the pacing of the narration would be accurate. And I think for this part, I was off by 2 measures. So there's actually a point where I had to stretch the piece of music by 2 measures when I got the actual footage, but that wasn't too bad.
Lyle hit Nom squarely in the face. And that was that. Best friends.
I'm going to...
Then there's a long, unaccompanied dialogue section where Lyle tries unsuccessfully to convince Jeremiah not to rob the bank. Then the narrator comes back and explains why Jeremiah is going to rob the bank. And it involves this eccentric homeless guy that Jeremiah used to pass by on his way to work. So for music for an eccentric homeless guy, I put in some guitar sounds.
This is why. Every day when walking home from work, Jeremiah's phobia of cars meant that he walked everywhere, Jeremiah would pass Jack Daniels on the side of the road, right by the yellow Planet Aid bin. Jeremiah knew that wasn't his real name, but it was his real smell.
These acoustic guitar sounds are not from the East-West bundle. These came with Apple's built-in libraries. And I have no idea whether it sounds realistic or not. I don't even know whether this combination of notes is playable on a guitar. I don't play the guitar.
During the week previous, Jeremiah walked home from work as he always did, but there was something nagging at the back of his mind. Something was missing. Then he realized that something was someone. Jack Daniels.
Basically, the same situation applies here for settling on the tempo and the pacing and being able to stretch and compress the music as the footage demands it. Here it was easier just because there's less going on in the music.
Maybe it was aliens. Maybe the government had gotten to him. Maybe he knew too much. Or maybe it was the whiskey. But Jeremiah knew that Jack was dead. Or maybe Jack had never lived at all, and then Jeremiah knew that he needed to rob a bank.
No reason. It's just something I have to do.
Okay, I just have to say that chord change at the end of the last musical cue bugs the hell out of me. I don't know what I was thinking. I mean, yes, I know what I was thinking. I was coming out of the Jack Daniels stretch that was in A minor. And then I was trying to set up the music for the entrance of the bank theme in F minor. But here's the thing, there's about to be a complete scene change, and when you have a big scene change like this, having a key change that seems out of the blue is completely in character. So if I had ended in the related key of E minor and then jumped into F, that would have been fine. And I was also trying to underscore the goofy non sequitur where Jeremiah is so freaked out by the disappearance of Jack Daniels that he has to go rob a bank. But keeping it moving smoothly between related keys would be more reflective of Jeremiah's state of mind, because obviously he feels that it's perfectly natural for him to go rob a bank in reaction to Jack Daniels' disappearance. The humor for the audience is that it's a complete non sequitur, but that's not what's going through his mind. Oh, and this last chord just sticks out like a sore thumb. I think either I should have left it off altogether, or maybe a few chords might have been better. I don't know. Anyway, it was composing the music more or less sequentially so that each passage could build upon the thematic material of the previous passage. The film, however, was not made sequentially, and that's pretty typical. There are usually practical or logistical reasons that you want to get certain scenes out of the way first. In the case of Jeremiah, they got the bank scenes out of the way first because of the hassle of renting the RISD library. I believe they had to do it early Sunday mornings because that was when the library was closed for library business. And also, anytime they filmed scenes where the gun was involved, they had to have a security guard present who could make sure that the gun was actually a non-functioning replica.
That's exactly what this is.
Huh?
I visited the set on, I think, the second Sunday, and that helped me get a feel for the production. But what really helped was that about a third of the way through composing the film, I finally caught up with what Mike was working on filming. And so he was able to throw together rough edits of certain sections for me to work with. And I think you can tell at some point in the film that the quality of the music starts going up.
Everybody on the ground!
Petunia realized that her gunshot may have alerted everyone in the room to the fact that a gun had been fired.
I think that's probably my favorite line in the entire film. Petunia realized that her gunshot may have alerted everyone to the fact that a gun had been fired.
Jeremiah?
I'm kind of busy.
Jeremiah, were you planning on robbing this bank?
Can we talk about this later?
The themes for Powell, Delilah, and Petunia didn't give me that much trouble. I mean, Powell is this part-time magician and kind of an awkward guy.
This is Powell. He is a security guard and a part-time magician. He mostly does birthday parties. Here are some things you should know.
Delilah is this constantly daydreaming bank teller.
This is Delilah. Here are some things you should know. Delilah is a bank teller.
And Petunia was tricky because she's the one who ends up holding up the bank, but when she's introduced by the narrator, we don't know that yet, and the music shouldn't give anything away, so I had to write something that was suitably quirky.
This is Petunia Green. She is 5 foot 1.5 inches and 138 pounds.
There are two main approaches to scoring for a film. One is the leitmotif approach, where you write different themes for all the different characters, or sometimes different locations. And the other is you just write for the moment, and you don't try to tie down characters to themes. And you'll notice that I've been taking the leitmotif approach in scoring Jeremiah. A criticism I sometimes hear of the leitmotif approach is that it threatens to turn the music into just a series of cliches. The villain enters, so you hear the villain's music, and so on, to the point where the different melodies actually become a distraction rather than an enhancement of the emotion of the moment. And that is a danger, but I don't think it's an insurmountable one. You just have to remember that the collection of themes are not a set of hard and fast rules, but just a jumping off point, and that you have to keep it fresh by sometimes mixing them up a little bit or writing variations on the themes. For example, for all of Delilah's highly detailed daydreams, I had a lot of fun writing different variations on her theme.
Delilah sometimes imagines herself as a superhero whose alter ego is a bank teller and must be an average to slightly above average employee to keep up her cover so that no one suspects that at night she's a vigilante ridding the streets of crime one strangely named supervillain at a time.
And then toward the end of the film, where Jeremiah becomes locally famous and ends up in all the papers, I wrote this upbeat ragtime variation on his theme.
And Jeremiah became an overnight sensation. He was on a local talk show, he shook hands, he kissed babies. He was that sort of famous that only lasts for about a day.
I think one reason why it was so fun for me to work on Jeremiah was that Mike was so happy to have an actual composer working on the film that he basically let me do whatever the hell I wanted. I definitely would not expect most directors to take such a laissez-faire approach. But there were a handful of places where we had to compromise on some things. For example, there's this one part where Jeremiah and Delilah come face to face for the first time. Jeremiah, up to that point, has been determined to rob the bank, but the moment his eyes meet Delilah's, he becomes so flustered that he just can't go on with it.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah, I just... please understand, it's nothing personal.
Do you need help or something?
And I had written a bit of music to go with that. It was some piano music. But when we put it together, we just couldn't find a way to make it work. I remember Mike invited me to the final day of editing so that I could stand over his shoulder and make sure that all the music lined up with where I wanted it. And when we got to that point, we played it over several times, tried moving the music around a little bit, and finally we decided, no, we just have to get rid of this and let it be unaccompanied. And I think that was the right decision.
I'll be back.
Okay.
Like the Terminator.
Okay.
Except I'm not a cyborg or whatever. I'm not Arnold Schwarzenegger.
There's another part where Jeremiah and Delilah are kneeling over the wounded Powell. And Jeremiah and Delilah are falling in love, and Powell is just lying there, awkward third wheel. And the music I wrote for it, I was worried about because I thought it was going to kind of get in the way of the dialogue. But Mike thought it would work if we just turned the volume way down and let it be really subtle and slowly build up. And that turned out to work great.
Sometimes in movies they put pressure on gunshot wounds, you know? Yeah.
Am I pushing too hard?
No, it's fine. I'm fine.
Okay, because if I am, you can tell me.
Okay.
I'm Jeremiah, by the way.
Delilah.
Powell.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Pleasure.
I don't really want to show any more of the film here because really you should just go watch the whole thing yourself. But this was so much fun to work on. And I remember the day of the premiere, there were about 200 people watching, and they all loved it. Unfortunately, when they got to the end, they all stood up and applauded and cheered so loudly that you couldn't hear the end credits music. The thing is, listening to it now, it's still pretty convincing as far as sounding like a real orchestra, but it's not as convincing as it was to me back then. There are parts where it just feels a little bit too robotic, a little too perfect, and so given the chance, I would absolutely work with real musicians instead. I have composed one other film score since Jeremiah, but that'll have to be a story for another time. So go watch Jeremiah, link in the description, and I'll see you next video. I'm Ben, signing off.